were a mistake your father paid to make disappear, and the only reason you grew up in this house is that the check bounced. My sister said those words to me in the parking lot of Holy Redeemer, 40 feet from the hearse that still held our parents' caskets. And she said them loud enough that two of the pallbearers turned around. I remember thinking, in that strange underwater way grief makes you think, that she must have rehearsed it. Nobody comes up with something that cruel on the spot. And then the second thought arrived, the one that would keep me up for 11 straight nights. What if she's telling the truth? What if the two people we just buried were never really mine at all? My name is Romy Ellsworth. I'm 31 years old, and I live in Birchport, Michigan, one of those little lake towns where the gas station owner's your coffee order, and a roomer can make it from the marina to the church potluck before lunch. 12 days ago, my parents, Gordon and Annette, were driving home from the hospital fundraiser they chaired every winter when a semi-jackknifed on black ice on Route 31. The trooper told me they never saw it coming. He meant it as a comfort. Before I go any further, if you're listening to this, do me a small kindness. Hit the like button and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. On the hard nights, it helps to know somebody's out there. Thank you. The resection after the burial was at the VFW hall because Dad had fixed boat engines for half the veterans in this county and they wouldn't hear of us paying for it. I was standing by the folding table with the coffee urns, holding a styrofoam cup. I had no intention of drinking, when my sister crossed the room toward me with her chin up like she was accepting an award. She's 38, 7 years older, and she has spent our whole lives treating those 7 years like a deed to the family. She glanced around first, made sure Aunt Gwen was trapped in conversation by the casserole table, and then she leaned in close. She told me Mom and Dad had carried a secret for 3 decades, that I wasn't their daughter, that I was the leftover problem from an affair Dad had the year their marriage almost fell apart, that my so-called real mother had dropped me off when I was a year old and vanished, and that Mom had only agreed to keep me because divorce would have humiliated her in front of the whole congregation. She said it all in this calm, dry voice, like a nurse reading a chart. Then she raised her volume, just enough. She announced that the estate, the house on Knollwood, Dad's marina, the investments, all of it, came to about $2.8 million, and as the only legitimate child, she said, every cent was hers. I was entitled to exactly nothing, and she'd already spoken to a lawyer to make sure of it. I want to tell you I fell apart quietly and with dignity. I didn't. I laughed. One short, ugly bark of a laugh, because it was so absurd, and then I heard myself say, louder than I meant to, show me, right now. Show me the will, show me one document, one photograph, one anything. And for half a second, just half, something flickered across her face. Then she smiled and said grieving people shouldn't make scenes, and she walked away to accept condolences like a queen walking a rope line. But the seed was in. That's the thing about a lie like that. It doesn't need proof. It just needs a crack to crawl into, and grief is nothing but cracks. Cousin Kira was already typing on her phone before my sister even finished her victory lap. By the time I got home that night, 3 people had texted me some version of "Is it true?" with a number of question marks that told me exactly how fast it was spreading. She gave me 30 days to move out of the house. I've been living in the converted apartment over the garage for almost 3 years, ever since Mom's stroke. Driving her to physical therapy in Traverse City twice a week. Doing the marina's bookkeeping at the kitchen table at night. Because Dad's eyes were getting bad and he was too proud to say so. My sister mentioned none of that. She slid a typed letter under the garage door, hand-delivered by her husband, who stood on the gravel looking at his shoes and said, "I'm sorry, Romy," so quietly I almost missed it, and then practically ran back to his truck. Here's where I should answer the question some of you are already asking because you're sharp, and I love you for it. No, she had no legal power to evict anybody 12 days after a death, before probate even opened. I know that now. Mr. and now, Amberson would later call her letter decorative. But I didn't know it then, and she was counting on that. Cruelty works fastest on people, too sad to look things up. That first week, I did the thing you should never do. I went looking for evidence against myself. I dragged the photo bins down from the attic and spread 30 years across the living room floor. And I found things. There's a gap, you see. The albums go from their wedding through my sister's early childhood, page after careful page of her, in smock dresses with her hair ribboned. And then the pictures thin out, and when I appear, I'm already a toddler, round-faced and serious, wearing a snowsuit 2 sizes too big, clutching a stuffed rabbit so worn its ears were gray. No hospital bracelet photo. No coming home from the maternity ward picture. Nothing before age 2. And in those earliest pictures of me, my mother is smiling, but her eyes look like she'd been crying for a year. Have you ever looked back at a happy memory and watched it change right in front of you? That's what those nights were. Every kindness recast itself as guilt. Dad teaching me to rebuild a carburetor when I was 10. His big hands over mine. Was that love, or was it penance? Mom driving 4 hours to every one of my dental hygiene board exams just to sit in the parking lot so I'd know she was near. Devotion, or a debt being paid? My sister got the ski trips, the sorority dues, the brand new Jetta at 16, the wedding at the resort on Mackinac that I know for a fact cost more than my entire education. I got hand-me-downs and a job at the Marina office every summer from age 14. I'd always told myself it was because I was the easy kid. Now there was a darker explanation sitting in the room with me, and it never blinked. My best friend Sutton showed up on day 4 with a lasagna and a folder of printouts about estate law, because that's who she is. She kept saying, "Romy, even if it were true, which it is not, adopted kids inherit. This isn't 1870. My boyfriend of 2 years, Cole, took a different approach. He went quiet for a couple of days, and when he finally came over, he asked me, very gently, like he was diffusing something, whether I'd ever considered that this might explain why I kept people at arm's length. I asked him what that was supposed to mean. He said my sister had reached out to him actually, because she was worried about me. Because apparently, I had a history of getting unstable when I didn't get my way. I stood in my own kitchen and listened to a man I'd thought I might marry recite my sister's talking points back to me like he'd studied. I told him to get out. At the door he said, and I will never forget this, "She warned me you'd react like this." They'd been talking about me, comparing notes, and he had picked her version. Meanwhile, my sister was conducting her takeover like a woman with a checklist. She went to the bank and tried to drain Mum and Dad's accounts, and got turned away because nothing had cleared probate. She showed up at the marina and told Dad's service manager, a sweet bear of a man who'd worked there 19 years, that she'd be evaluating staffing. She tried to change the gate code at the boat storage yard and locked herself inside the fence for 2 hours in 18-degree weather because she'd reprogrammed it without writing the new code down, and the fire department had to come let her out. The whole town heard about that one by dinner time, and I confess it was the first time I smiled in 2 weeks. But mostly what she did was talk. She told the women at Mom's Bible study that the reason I'd moved home wasn't to take care of Mom at all. It was because I'd been fired downstate for stealing from patients and absolute fabrication. I left that practice with a letter of recommendation I still have. She told the pharmacist I'd been skimming Mom's pain medication, which was its own special knife, because I was the one who sorted Mom's pills into those little day-of-the-week boxes every Sunday night for 3 years. I was the one who sat with her doing the hand exercises she hated, and in a town this size, the loudest story wins. Mrs. Pruitt, who'd been Mom's closest friend since high school, saw me at the IGA and turned her cart around. The hygienist I carpooled with suddenly couldn't carpool anymore. The silence in the break room when I walked in had a texture to it like wet wool. Then came the night that turned everything, though I didn't know it yet. My brother-in-law called me at 11 p.m. from inside his truck. I could tell he was inside his truck because he was whispering, and I could hear the wind off the lake. He talked for 6 minutes straight, like a man getting something out from under his ribs. He said my sister had been planning this since the summer, since she'd somehow found out Mom and Dad had met with their attorney to update their estate plan. He said she paid some lawyer friend from her gym to research whether an adopted child could be cut out of an inheritance. And then he said the thing that made the room tilt. He said, "Romy, she's been taking money from them for years. The marina invoices. Ask about the invoices." And he hung up. I did the books, remember. So the next morning, I went back through the marina's records with new eyes, and there it was. Once I knew what I was looking for. A vendor called Lakeshore Mechanical Solutions, invoicing for engine parts and dock repairs, $800 here, $2,000 there. going back 6 years. Almost $280,000 total. I processed some of those invoices myself. God help me. They look completely legitimate. Lakeshore Mechanical Solutions had a logo and an address and a tax ID. What it did not have was an actual existence. The address was a UPS store in Petoskey. The account the payments went to traced back eventually to a business registration with my sister's maiden initials buried in the paperwork. And there was worse underneath it. Dad had known. I found his handwriting in the margins of a statement from 14 months ago. One word circled twice, AJ. They'd caught her, and they'd never said a word, never pressed charges, never even cut her off completely. I couldn't understand it. These were not naive people. Why would they let their own daughter bleed them for years and protect her from the consequences? I got my answer at 7:40 on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang with a number I didn't know. The voice on the other end was elderly, precise, and careful in a way that suggested a lifetime of saying only what he meant. He introduced himself as Mr. Amberson, my parents' attorney of 31 years. He said he'd been instructed by my parents, explicitly and in writing, to wait until after their funeral to contact me and to do so privately. He said, and I'm quoting him as best I remember, "Your sister has been calling my office daily, and yesterday she sat in the parking lot for an hour, so I'd rather not meet here. Do you know the diner on Galloway Street? 2 o'clock. Bring nothing. Tell no one." Before that meeting, I did one thing. The night before, going through Mom's closet because I missed the smell of her, I'd found her sewing box, the wooden one with the painted lilacs she'd had since before I was born. The bottom tray had always stuck. I'd never thought about why. That morning, I pried at it, and it lifted away to reveal a shallow false bottom, and inside, wrapped in a flowered handkerchief, were two things: a small brass key stamped with the name of the First Community Bank, and a note in Mom's looping hand, 10 words long. "For Romy, when you're ready, you were always wanted." I sat on the closet floor and cried until my ribs hurt. Then I drove to the diner. If you're still with me in this story, thank you, truly. If it's grabbed you, take 1 second and subscribe, because there are more stories where this came from, and your being here matters more than you know. Now let me tell you about Mr. Amberson, because my parents chose their guardian well. He was waiting in the corner booth, mid-70s, wire glasses, a top coat that had outlived several presidents, and a brown accordion folder thick as a Bible. He stood to shake my hand, looked at me a moment too long, and said, "You have her chin." I assumed he meant my mother. He did, just not the mother I was thinking of. Here's what he told me, while our coffee went cold. 32 years ago, my mum's younger sister, Elise, was 23, newly pregnant and newly diagnosed with a heart condition her doctors said made the pregnancy a gamble. The man involved left skid marks. Elise moved into the house on Norwood, into the room that would later be mine. My parents, who had been trying for a second child for years by then, cared for her through all of it. And Elise refused, flat out, to consider ending the pregnancy or placing the baby with strangers. She made my parents promise in this lawyer's office with documents that if anything went wrong, they would raise her child as their own. 11 days after I was born, her heart failed. She lived long enough to name me Romy after a film actress she loved and to hold me one time. So the cruel arithmetic my sister had performed at the funeral was wrong in every direction. I wasn't the souvenir of an affair. I was my mother's biological niece, her sister's blood, her family's blood, legally adopted within the year, with paperwork so clean, Mr. Amberson called it the most carefully documented adoption I have handled in 50 years of practice. And then he folded his hands and said, "There is something else you need to understand before next week, because your parents wanted you to hear it from me and not in a courtroom." He paused the way people pause at the top of a roller coaster. "Your sister is also adopted. She has known since she was 21, and the knowing is, I'm afraid, the beginning of everything that's happened to your family since." I actually asked him to repeat it. My sister, the keeper of legitimacy, the only real daughter, had been adopted at 18 months old when Dad's stepbrother went to prison downstate and his girlfriend left the state and the baby behind. My parents never told her as a child. They planned to do it gently in stages. Instead, she found her own adoption decree at 21, snooping through Dad's desk for cash. And what did she do with the most tender, complicated discovery of her life? She did not grieve it. She priced it. She went to our parents and told them that unless her lifestyle continued to be funded, she would tell me the truth about this family in the most public, most devastating way she could design, and that she'd make sure I believed I'd never been wanted. Every imbalance of our childhood, the resort wedding, the Jetta, the ski trips, none of it was favoritism. It was ransom. They paid it for years to protect me, and when the cash demands turned into forged invoices, they paid in silence instead because the threat never expired. But my parents were not as helpless as she believed. 8 years ago, the same month the fake invoices started, they came to this office and built a revocable living trust. The house, the marina, the brokerage accounts, the life insurance, everything went into it. Outside the trust, they left a simple will covering maybe $60,000 in odds and ends, and that will, the only document my sister had ever seen, left that small remainder to her. The trust had a single beneficiary. It was me, and attached to the trust was a sealed file, 60 pages of it, that my father had assembled with the patience of a man who rebuilt engines for a living. Every fraudulent invoice. Bank records tracing Lakeshore Mechanical Solutions to her. The forged signature on a home equity application she'd submitted against their house, caught and cancelled before funding. A handwriting analysis Dad had commissioned privately 2 years ago. They never used any of it. Mr. Amberson said Dad sat in that office and said, "It's for if she ever comes after Romy." Not before. The safe deposit box, the one Mum's brass key opened, held the soft side of the same story. Letters from Elise, one addressed to me, to the daughter she knew she might never raise, in handwriting that slanted exactly like mine, photographs of her at my age, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't sit in that little bank room and touch her face on the paper, because we have the same chin, the same cowlick, the same too loud laugh. You could see it even in a still photo. There was a DNA report my parents had done quietly when I was 6, confirming what they already knew, that I was Mom's niece by blood. And there was Mom's journal. One entry, from 2 springs ago, I have memorized. We gave her things when we should have given her a spine. That was our failure, and we own it. But she will not take Romy's belonging from her. The trust holds. Whatever she burns down, that one thing will not burn. While I was learning all this, my sister was out spending money she did not have on a fortune she was never getting. She leased a Mercedes GLS in January, when the ground at our parents' grave hadn't settled. She put a deposit on a condo in Naples, Florida, sight unseen. She hired a designer to gut Mom's kitchen, with the pencil marks on the doorframe where we were measured every birthday, and told the contractor the budget was whatever it takes. We're closing on the estate within the month. And she kept talking. She'd convinced Cousin Kira and 2 others to sign statements swearing they'd watched me pressure Mom and Dad about money. Kira owed my sister $4,000 from a candle business that never launched, so her signature came cheap. Then my sister destroyed herself the way people like her eventually do with her own phone. She meant to call her husband. She instead reached Aunt Gwen's landline. And when no one picked up, the answering machine, because Aunt Gwen is 80 and proudly owns an answering machine, recorded 90 seconds of my sister, mid-rant, coaching her husband on the plan. Stick to the script. Romy's unstable. She stole from them. The cousins will back it up. And once the estate closes, everybody who helped gets taken care of. Mom always said Romy was the charity case. Now we finally get to send the charity back. Aunt Gwen listened to that machine twice, then drove the cassette, the actual physical cassette, to 4 relatives' houses in one afternoon, like a one-woman Paul Revere. By Sunday, my sister had been removed from the family group chat. Uncle Monty had told her not to come to Easter, and her claim that she'd been hacked was the funniest thing Birchport had heard all winter, because you cannot hack an answering machine from 1994. She tried to regain control the only way she knew, with a show. She announced a celebration of life at our parents' house, printed invitations, the works, and pointedly didn't invite me. Aunt Gwen brought me anyway, arm linked through mine like a bailiff. Inside, my sister had staged the house like an estate sale, little cream-colored cards on the furniture noting who'd be receiving what. Mom's piano promised to her own daughter. Dad's tools, earmarked for her husband, who stood by the fireplace looking like a hostage. And on her own finger, my mother's engagement ring, the quarter-carat solitaire Dad had saved 2 years of Navy pay to buy. When I saw it, I heard my own voice come out steady. I said Mom had promised me that ring on her last birthday, in front of Aunt Gwen. And Aunt Gwen said, "She did. I was there." My sister laughed, that bright hostess laugh, and said this gathering was for family. Real family. That was the moment Mr. Amberson walked in. I will treasure it until I die. Topcoat, briefcase, galoshes, because it was sleeting, and the timing of a man who had absolutely been parked outside, waiting for his cue. He addressed my sister by her full married name, informed her that the formal reading of the complete estate documents would take place at the county courthouse Friday at 10, and leaned, just slightly, on the word complete. She went pale under her bronzer. She said she already had the will and didn't need a reading. He smiled like a man laying down a winning hand and said the will was one document among several, that he was bound by our parents' written instructions to present everything publicly, with witnesses, and that disposing of a single estate asset before Friday, his eyes went to the ring, would constitute conversion of property, which is a polite legal word for theft. She tried to twist the ring off right there. Her knuckle had swollen, sleet and stress and lunch wine, and the whole room, 40-some people, watched her wrestle her own hand and lose, and finally marched to the kitchen sink, where we heard the water running and language that does not belong at a memorial. Uncle Monty said quietly into his coffee, "There it is." Friday, the courthouse was standing room only. I'm not exaggerating. Half of Birchport came. The IGA put a sign in the window that said, "Back at noon." My sister arrived flanked by 2 lawyers from a Grand Rapids firm she could not afford, in funeral black and a fresh spray tan that had cured several shades past believable. I sat in front between Mr. Amberson and Aunt Gwen. My brother-in-law sat alone, 3 rows back on my side of the aisle, which told everyone everything. Judge Salas ran a tight courtroom and had bought her pontoon boat from my father, which is the most Birchport sentence I will ever say. Mr. Amberson began with the will, the one my sister had been brandishing for a month. It was real and valid, he confirmed, and her shoulders dropped in relief. And he let her have that relief for one full sentence before explaining that the will governed only assets outside the Ellsworth family trust, established 8 years prior, which held the house, the marina, every account. Roughly $2.75 million. Sole beneficiary, Romy Elise Ellsworth. Her lawyers objected that they'd never been told of any trust. Mr. Yo, Amberson observed, dryly, that it was on file with this very court and discoverable by anyone who did an hour of homework, and both attorneys turned to look at their client like men who'd just heard the iceberg. My sister came up out of her chair screaming that I was adopted, that I wasn't even an Ellsworth, that blood was blood and no piece of paper could change it. And Mr. Amberson, who had clearly been waiting 30 years to say it, agreed with her completely. I was adopted, he said, after my biological mother, Elise. My mother's own sister died days after my birth, making me a blood relative of this family in any case. Then he turned a page, and so was she. Adopted at 18 months, aware of it for 17 years. He read the date on her decree out loud. He also noted, for anyone keeping legal score, that under Michigan law adopted children inherit exactly as biological children do, that no one in that family had ever needed to be anyone's blood to be anyone's heir, and that this was precisely why a lie had been necessary, because the law was never, at any point, on her side. The room did not gasp so much as detonate, and into that noise Mr. Amberson played the video. My parents had recorded it 3 years ago at his office. Mom went first, hands folded, looking straight down the lens the way she looked at you when you were sick. She talked about loving 2 daughters differently because they needed different things, about the years of paying and hoping, about the moment the hoping stopped. Dad's section was an engine man's inventory, calm and devastating. Invoices on screen. Bank routing, the forged HELOC application beside a real signature, the loops all wrong. $280,000, give or take, taken by one daughter, while they shielded her from prison and shielded me from her. And then the part I can barely talk about. Dad looked into the camera and said, "Romy, you were never a mistake, never a burden, never second." You were a promise we made to someone we loved, and keeping you was the easiest promise of our lives." Mom's last line, the one half this town can quote now, was, "Blood is just how you start. Love is how you stay. We chose you every single day for 30 years, sweetheart. And if there's a day after all the days, we'll choose you then too." When the lights came up, Judge Salas was wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her robe. The bailiff was sniffling. Aunt Gwen had gone through her tissues and started on mine. The only dry eyes in the courthouse belonged to my sister. And people noticed. They always notice. She stood and called the video a deepfake. She called the trust a forgery, the adoption decrees fabrications, Mr. Amberson a senile old man I had seduced into conspiracy, her words, and the entire town of Birchport a cult. Her own attorneys were packing their briefcases while she was still talking. Then her husband stood up. In front of everyone, he said he'd filed for divorce that morning, that he'd spent 9 years watching her steal from the two kindest people he'd ever met and telling himself it wasn't his business and that he was done. He turned to me in front of the whole county and apologized for the letter under the garage door. Said he'd carried it up that driveway like a coward, and he'd regretted it every day since. Judge Salas confirmed the trust, ordered the ring and all estate property surrendered by end of day, and noted, looking over her glasses, that the documentation she'd just seen was being referred to the county prosecutor, on cue, like the whole day had been scored by somebody upstairs. A sheriff's deputy stepped in and informed my sister she was the subject of a fraud and financial elder abuse investigation, and should not leave the state. She grabbed her bag and stormed for the doors, and on the icy courthouse steps in front of the local news camera that had shown up for the spectacle, her heels skated out from under her and she sat down hard in the slush. And her bag, one of those purses that says Prado if you look closely, split at the seam and dealt its contents across the steps like a losing hand. Past due notices. Mom and Dad's visa, which she had no business holding, and a printed page headlined in her own font choices. When the money hits. Item 1, pay off cards. Item 4, Naples closing. Item 9, and I quote, "Make sure R gets the message and leaves town." The photo someone took of her sitting in the slush surrounded by her own paperwork is, to this day, the most shared image in the history of the Birchport Community Facebook page. That was 6 months ago. I live in the house on Knollwood now. I left the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame. All of them hers too. Mom's tomatoes came up in June like she'd planted them herself. And I caught myself out there one evening telling her about them, out loud like a crazy person, and then I decided that if this is crazy, I don't want to be well. My sister pleaded out. Restitution she'll be paying for decades, 500 hours of community service, a suspended sentence the judge made very clear was a one-time mercy. The $60,000 from the will went almost poetically straight to her lawyers. The Mercedes went back on a flatbed. The Naples deposit gone. Her husband's divorce went through in the fall, and he sent me a letter, an actual paper letter, that I read 3 times and answered once, telling him forgiveness was a road and I was on it, somewhere. Kira cried at my kitchen table and confessed the $4,000 and the threats behind her signature, and I forgave her, mostly, the way you forgive family on layaway. Mom's friend, Mrs. Beshens Pruitt, who turned her cars around at the IGA, showed up on my porch with a pound cake and an apology, and we both cried over the pound cake, and it was a good pound cake. And that's how small towns heal, one casserole dish at a time. With part of the trust, I started the Elise Fund at the regional hospital. It covers lodging and gas and groceries for family caregivers, the daughters and sons and nieces sleeping in waiting room chairs, because I know exactly what those 3 years cost me, and exactly what those 3 years cost me, and exactly what they were worth. The first grant went to a 26-year-old taking care of the grandmother who raised her. When I handed her the paperwork, she had Elise's same stubborn chin. I take signs where I find them. The marina's thriving under the service manager Dad trusted, and I drew the books on Thursday nights at the same kitchen table. And the smell of the place, diesel and lake water and cold metal, still feels like Saturday mornings with my father. Mr. Reft, Amberson and I have a standing lunch on the first Friday of every month, where he tells me stories, like how Dad drove through a whiteout to get to the hospital the night I was born, Or how Mum kept Elise's worn grey rabbit and tucked it into my crib the day they brought me home. Her sister's last gift, riding shotgun into my whole life. I sleep with that rabbit on the nightstand now. I'm 31 years old and I do not care. I saw my sister last week at the discount grocery out by the highway, counting coins at the register in a cashier's vest with her name tag slightly crooked. Our eyes met over the conveyor belt for about 2 seconds. I waited to feel triumphant. What I felt instead was something quieter and sadder, because she'd had it all. The parents, the resort wedding, a husband who stayed 9 years past reason, a kid sister who spent 30 years trying to earn her approval like it was a merit badge, and she traded every bit of it for money that was never going to be hers. She looked away first. She was right about exactly one thing, my sister. I was adopted. But she was wrong about what that word means. It doesn't mean unwanted. It means somebody stood in a lawyer's office and signed their name to a promise, and then kept it every day for 30 years and built a wall of paper around me that held even after they were gone. Blood is just the introduction. Showing up is the marriage, and being chosen on purpose over and over by people who knew exactly what they were choosing, that isn't second place to anything. That's the whole prize. There's a moment I keep coming back to, months later, standing at the sink in Mom's kitchen. My sister didn't lose everything in that courtroom. She lost it years earlier, the first time she forged an invoice and the world didn't stop her. Everything after that was just the bill arriving. That's the thing nobody tells you about consequences. They're patient. They let you lease the Mercedes first. I used to think my parents were pushovers. They knew about the stealing for years and never said a word. And for a while after I learned that, I was almost angry at them. But they weren't weak. They were doing quiet, careful work the whole time, building the trust, keeping the records, sitting in Mr. Amberson's office writing down the truth while my sister spent their money. They couldn't control what she did. They could control what she did. They chose honesty in a locked drawer over a war at the dinner table, and they chose to protect me without ever poisoning me against her. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Character isn't loud. Sometimes it's just 60 pages of receipts and a promise kept for 30 years. And here's what I learned about being smart, because I wasn't, not at first. I spent 11 nights believing a lie because grief made me lazy. I cried over photo albums when 1 hour with the county records would have told me my sister had no legal leg to stand on. The lie almost won not because it was clever, but because I didn't check. Aunt Gwen drove a cassette tape to 4 houses in one afternoon. Mr. Amberson did an hour of homework her 2 expensive lawyers never bothered with. Thinking clearly isn't a talent. It's a habit, and it's free. And it would have saved me a week and a half of believing I was nobody. The last piece took me longest. There were so many mornings I wanted to take Cole's advice and just walk away, let her have it all, because fighting felt ugly and I was so tired. But Elise carried me for 9 months knowing her heart might not survive it. My mother did hand exercises she hated, twice a day for 3 years after her stroke, and never once quit. The people who loved me did hard things slowly without applause, until the hard things were done. So I stayed. I showed up at the gathering I wasn't invited to. I walked into that courtroom, not because I'm brave, but because giving up would have made their endurance worthless, and I couldn't live with that. My sister wanted a shortcut to a life she hadn't built, and the shortcut led to a cash register and a crooked name tag. My parents took the long way, telling the truth on paper, doing right when nobody was watching, holding on for decades, and the long way is still holding me up after they're gone. That's the whole ledger, as far as I can tell. What you plant is what comes up. Mom's tomatoes taught me that too.